Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. It is wonderful to be here on this week's Hoon. We're back. It is just gone 5 o'clock on Thursday, and that means it's Hoon time with myself, Bernard Hickey from the Kaka, and co-host Peter Bale. Lovely to see you, Peter.
Bernard, it's very good to see you too. And I know you've been for a swim. You look great having been for a swim. I so admire you keeping this going. I won't suggest that you show us pictures of the skinny dipping.
La.
Yeah, but it's it's just so brilliant that you're doing it, because it's I think if we all follow those good instructions about how to live longer, going and swimming in the sea in the middle of winter from Waiheke is a brilliant thing to do.
Yes, no, it is quite confronting and sobering, but also slightly worrying because it seems to get warmer in every year, and as we find out later in the show, there is some real temperature action happening in the climate, not to mention plenty of attempts to try and deal with this. But if it is going to be a warmer planet, it's quite nice to swim in winter. This is
but it really looks like it's been reviving for you though, Bernard, as well.
Oh, it's
good on you.
Fantastic. Yep. No, I'm really enjoying it.
Of course, I should be doing that too, but I looked out today and it was quite low tide where I am, and I saw the swans. The beaches around Point Chev and Herne Bay and Cox's Bay have been kind of invaded by a couple of hundred black swans.
Ooh.
I mean, real black swans, not just unexpected economic events, real live black swans.
And do they have like a high tide mark, like a bath that's got all the
I think they must have. I haven't been out to swim out to see them, but I think they must have. I looked out there the other day and I thought it was basically the Loch Ness monster, but it was just a couple of swans.
Of swans. And I do worry about that inner harbour in Auckland, particularly after rain. A lot of stuff goes into that harbour.
Well, funny you should say that, because I sent you, I think, a document from the Herne Bay Residents Association, because the extension of the Eastern Interceptor has been suspended for a while because of Three Waters, and it's now being incorporated into the Auckland Council budget, it's being delayed. And so there will be more, it's not quite the River Seine, but there will be more shit and wee and various other things going into the Waitemata, which is a pity.
And all because the government wants to reduce government debt and reduce government borrowing, because it wants to get mortgage rates that little bit lower. So your harbour is going to be filthy.
Our harbour, I think. But well, actually, mind you, yours is the Gulf. Carry on.
Is going to be filthier just for the sake of 1 or 2 basis points of lower mortgage rates for the median voters who decide on who's going to be the government.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? And so Bernard, I think you've got a soliloquy coming up at the end of our opening session, and we're going to open with media, and then we're going to push this extraordinary Donald Trump story about his outrageously racist outburst at the National Association of Black Journalists in the United States. We'll push that to the skateboarding dog, but there is a serious aspect to that, which is, we sometimes talk about this, but I think we may need to do more on it. The idea about how quickly strange trends or unpleasant trends from the US Maori, of course, about who's Maori enough and so on, and ACT, of course, is stirring the entire pot right across the legislative kind of remit about race and how race fits in, and whether we have any responsibilities to Indigenous people. So that we might do that as a slightly serious skateboarding dog at the end.
Yes, things are happening in the rest of the world that are definitely affecting us, and we'll talk a bit about that with Catherine Dyer in our climate section. Unfortunately, Robert Patman is not going to be with us this week.
I know. I'm really appalled that he's eschewed us for in favour of educating military people at the New Zealand Department of Defence.
We're so lucky that we
Yeah,
have him at all, and
we
to
are.
have him so many weeks in a row is amazing, and he certainly deserves a break. So thank you to him, and we'll be back again next week. So it'll be Peter and I talking about more extraordinary events in the world of global politics, what's happening in the Middle East, that US presidential election, which is not any smooth or conventional thing, and of course what's happening too here in the debate about our foreign policy, which seemed to get a real run on this week. We've been talking about it for weeks and weeks on the Hoon. We had Helen Clark on several weeks ago talking about this. We regularly talk about it with Robert. But I get a sense it's like the rest of the country has woken up and gone, hang on a minute. Are we really going to throw our trade with China under the bus because the Prime Minister wants to schmooze with a bunch of
Yeah,
generals
yeah.
and PMs in
I think the
Washington?
answer is yes.
Yeah. So that will no doubt be up in our section on geopolitics. And then after 5:30, we'll be talking to Dr. Gary Payenda, who is an A&E doctor at Whangarei Base Hospital. This week has been all about the health crisis. I've tried where I can in the dawn choruses to cover it as tightly and closely as I can. And of course, I think this is the week when our health systems cascading, crumbling collapse really just dominated the news
Yeah.
flow. And we'll talk about what it says about the relationship between the public and the government. And then towards the end of the show, we will have Vic Crockford, who is the CEO of Community Housing Aotearoa, the overall group representing community housing groups that are trying to improve social housing, increase the number of social houses.
And are going to have to be taking on some pretty serious responsibilities.
Boy,
So,
yeah. I mean, Kāinga Ora was building 3,000 houses a year. The government's going to hand over 1,500 streams of revenue to the community housing providers and say, here, you go and build some houses, and we'll see whether it actually happens and also whether it's enough. In my view, it isn't. But that will be coming up later on. And for me, the dominant feature this week is that effectively now we have two very senior sets
are you
of
moving into your
boards.
soliloquy already?
Is that okay?
Yeah, all right. All right. It's not what we agreed about a minute ago, but do go ahead. Yep.
This week, the Health New Zealand board, Te Whatu Ora, and some very serious people on that board called bullshit on the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon's attempts to characterise the financial pressures at Te Whatu Ora and Kāinga Ora as the fault of an incompetent board and therefore the incompetent directors. And these are serious people. They are pushing back. We've obviously seen it already with the board at Kāinga Ora itself, which came back to the Kāinga Ora report authored by Bill English and the comments from Chris Bishop to say, no, there is no financial crisis. You haven't engaged with us. You're not serious people. And then we heard this week the Prime Minister in the Prime Ministerial question time essentially calling the directors of Te Whatu Ora financially illiterate, saying that they didn't ask the right questions about the finances of Kāinga Ora, that they seem to be
No,
unaware.
of Te Whatu Ora.
Te Whatu Ora, that they were unaware of what was actually going on with the money. And these, initially, everyone was sort of stunned that they would, and we assume when the Prime Minister comes out and attacks the directors of a company who they've just sacked, that there's some good reason for this, that these people are going to skulk away into a quiet place and not complain. Well, they didn't. They stood up, and we heard from the outgoing directors today at Te Whatu Ora, who are not going quietly at all. We heard, for example, from the former chair of the Medical Council, Dr. Curtis Walker. He is a kidney doctor, a specialist, a very serious person in New Zealand's community. He has been on multiple boards before. Again, a very professional person saying, no, those comments are completely baseless, that the government was using this accusation as a casus belli to put a commissioner in, which wasn't warranted. and that the government was simply responding to political pressure and spreading misinformation to achieve its own aims, which was to cut a couple of $1 billion to pay for tax cuts. So not only Dr. Curtis Walker, but we had Vanessa Stoddart, who is an independent a professional director, currently on the boards of Waste Management New Zealand and also Channel Infrastructure. So we're talking big end of town here. We're talking listed companies. You don't muck around. And it turns out, of course, she was also the general manager for people and operations for Air New Zealand between in the 9 years to 2013. So again, a very serious, financially aware executive at the head of our biggest internationally exposed company now, and a colleague of Christopher Luxon in the year of 2012 when he was the group general manager for International Airline. Now, she left that job almost immediately as soon as he was appointed as CEO. And
Because she realised he was a dick, or can we assume that?
I don't know that, and I wouldn't want to assume it or suggest it, and I suspect it might fall away in the edit. But that is a very serious thing to accuse someone of. Not only Dr. Curtis Walker and Vanessa Stoddart, but Naomi Ferguson, who for nearly 10 years ran Inland Revenue. So if you talk about someone...
Oh, Jesus, financially illiterate. How do we let her ever take charge of the IRD?
At a time when you could argue the most successful computer integration and rollout ever in the history of New Zealand was done. That is the new computer system that IRD has. Cost $1 billion, but it actually worked.
Yes.
And it's the reason why
Which
the
is
government...
extremely unusual in government IT contracts.
Yeah. And just today or yesterday, the Prime Minister said the government shouldn't be building IT systems. Well, why doesn't he have a look at the system that gathers all the money for the government, and which means actually that the budget receipts, the Crown accounts for the last few months have been better than expected, because that is a machine, that computer. It sucks up money from all over the place. And my giddy aunt.
And is also why you don't mess around with bringing money into the country or shifting money around in the country without it being legit.
Exactly. And why everyone is, contributing to the government's coffers whenever they buy anything. They pay GST. And if there's, as long as their income is PAYE or from some sort of wage or physical work or services work, as opposed to income from capital, which isn't taxed, then it works. So what I'm saying there is that this week, the big end of town in Aotearoa called bullshit on the Prime Minister's attempts to spread misinformation for his own political ends by claiming financial crises at two of our biggest operations, two of the biggest parts of the government, Kāinga Ora and Te Whatu Ora. And this is, I think, a key moment for the government and for the Prime Minister, who has presented himself as from the big end of town, as, financially literate. Well, when the people you accuse of being financially literate come back to you and say, bullshit, Prime Minister, then we've got a serious moment. So
did you see, Bernard, what he said about his, when asked today about the 14 layers and so on, he said, whoop-de-doo.
Whoop-de-doo.
Yeah.
Well, when the Prime Minister accuses the biggest organisation in the public service of a failed merger, of a botched merger, and uses the example of 14 layers of management, which, hey, that sounds bad, and then gets the numbers wrong and comes back and says whoop-de-doo when he's challenged on it, well, more than whoop-de-doo, Prime Minister.
Yeah, Humpty Dumpty says whoop-de-doo.
Yeah.
Now, Bernard, are you finished?
I'm finished.
I got told by somebody not to interrupt you, and of course I bloody didn't interrupt you. I let you bloody rabbit on for hours. And we'll get to Catherine in a second. Let me just do a couple of quick media stories, Catherine, because we're going to push you a little bit. So, a very interesting piece on RNZ today about the New Zealand Herald using what I assume was ChatGPT or something very similar to create editorials that it later published, which people realised had a sneaking resemblance to earlier reporting from the New Zealand Herald. Now, I'm all for excellent use of AI in journalism, but they should have been declared. I happen to know that the Herald now regards this as a learning moment, which it absolutely is. But it seemed extraordinary to use ChatGPT in that context. Like Business Desk, I've written stories about Business Desk using this. does a very good job of converting the NZX announcements from companies. They took about, I think it was a day or even less, maybe 3 hours to do 2,500 stories from the last kind of 5 or 6 years of NZX announcements, and then that becomes quite a fungible asset. But to use it for your editorials, which used to be the thing that, I mean, I don't particularly like or care about editorials because I prefer reportage, but I thought that was a rather extraordinary decision. So I think RNZ is going to be doing more on this. I might do more on it with them. But I thought that was a good idea that the Herald learns from this. I mean, I'm not sure using it for theoretically the part of the paper that represents your brand most importantly, or your voice, is quite right. On the other hand, let me refer you all, if you do have a subscription to the Herald, Steve Brownius's coverage of the trial in Auckland of the eye surgeon who may or may not have allegedly assisted his wife to commit suicide is an amazing set of reports. Some of the best and most colourful reporting you'll see is from Steve Brownius on that. Another big media story, which we've touched on briefly, but there's a really doozy, as we say, and a whoop-de-doo and doozy introduction to this, is Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister, has written a piece in the Guardian today accusing Sir William Lewis, the new chief executive of the Washington Post, of implicating him in a bogus conspiracy to steal emails from News International in London, which was given by William as the excuse for them destroying 32 million emails. And I think this is not going to end well for anybody. It's very ugly. Gordon, who I know, is a determined old bugger and will not take this lightly. It's a conspiracy. It's an excellent conspiracy.
And this is a major thing in the political economy of the United States. The Washington Post does punch above its weight. It's not just a small town newspaper. And Lewis essentially inherited what seemed to be a strong operation. It may not have been commercially fantastically successful, but the guy behind the Boston Globe Spotlight investigations,
Marty Barron,
created an extraordinary brand. Democracy dies in darkness. Now, it seemed over the top when it first came out. This was pre-Trump, but boy, did it resonate.
But what Gordon Brown does, is he says that the masthead, Democracy Dies in Darkness, appears over the Washington Post every day. What can we think about the chief executive being a master of the dark arts? So it's going to run that one. The good news in media today, potentially, is that Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, according to Ian Bremmer, who is the head of Eurasia Group, and a relatively reliable person, suggests that there is in fact a release going on kind of as we speak to release this Wall Street Journal journalist who was picked up in Ekaterinburg a couple of years ago now. But that will involve a really interesting prisoner exchange. So it will be extremely interesting to see who the Russians have obtained on the other side. And I very much hope it's not the FSB agent or GID agent who killed a Georgian activist on a bicycle in Berlin some months ago.
Yeah, that's really impressive and great news. I'm a subscriber to the Wall Street Journal. You could argue that its political views don't align at all with mine, but I find it a very useful publication. I don't read the editorial section, but they have campaigned hard
they've done a brilliant job
their guy. Every day there's a reminder. Hey, he's still in prison. Yep. We want to get him out.
No, it's important.
It's great, and I'm really pleased that that's
well, in
likely.
that sort of context, journalists and bloody John Irving's accusing me, I think, of rabbiting on, and nothing could be further from the truth, of course. Is we should note as well that 2 Al Jazeera journalists were killed overnight in Gaza. They were most definitely in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they, I think well over 100 journalists in Gaza have been killed. Yes, some of them have, been a little too close to Hamas or associated with Hamas. But, let's remember that there are no Western journalists allowed into Gaza by anybody, whether it's the Israelis or Hamas at the moment. One other thing I should mention, Bernard, because we do our sort of corrections and amplifications here, is I asked Julianne Genter last week when we were talking to her about transport, about her behaviour in the House. The House has now censured her, and she will presumably be apologising for her behaviour in the House for confronting a minister while speaking in the House. So there we go. And now we can move to climate, I think.
Yes, we'll look out for that. Thank you very much, Peter. Great to spend that time on media. And Catherine, thank you so much for jumping onto the show and waiting while we rabbit it on.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, steady on.
Catherine, it's been a heck of a week in the climate. And of course, we have a much more detailed conversation that goes out in a weekly climate wrap tomorrow for those who really want to get down and into the climate. But big news this week, firstly on methane. Now, this is important for New Zealand, the methane that our farms have produced, and not only it's a lot, but it's increased a lot in the last 20 years or so. Just think of all of those conversions of farms to dairy in the South Canterbury, Otago areas, Southland. Could you tell us what we found out this week about methane and why it matters to New Zealand?
Yeah, so there was this big new study that came out this week. It's published in the journal Frontiers in Science, and it's open access. So we have a link to it in the weekly climate wrap, and anybody can go and have a read of it. So this article was written by 15 international climate scientists, a very, well-regarded group. And they are talking about methane emissions and saying that they have been growing much, much faster than was expected or projected in any of our, forecast paths. And that means that rapid reductions are now necessary in methane emissions if we're going to stay on track for our Paris Agreement targets. So that piece of research, it's emerged at quite a critical time for Aotearoa because we've got two reviews going on about methane targets at the moment. So we've got one being done by the Climate Change Commission, and then we have this other panel that the government has set up to look at methane as well. And so there's a bit of a crossover between what's going on here. So if I go back to that new study that came out, the main reasons that the methane has accelerated a lot since 2006, part of it is to do with it's been a lot of fossil methane being released as a result of all the fracking activity and that the new LPG term, so it's associated with all of that, with CO2 leaks happening there at a much greater rate than what was expected. But the other big one, the really big one that we didn't know about until now, was that wetlands are, because of the warming that's already happened in the atmosphere, wetlands are starting to release methane, in particular over the period of El Nino. And that's worrying. That's a negative feedback, and we really don't want big negative methane feedbacks happening. So that's a real big warning from Mother Nature in general to stop heating the climate up. But all of that combined means that we need to reduce every source of methane to make up for that now.
And because methane is a much more heaty gas, at least initially, it goes away over time, unlike carbon dioxide. But in the initial...
Did you say heaty?
Yeah, as in like it heats too much. It does a lot more heating. Yeah, that's a scientific term. It is incredibly important if you want to have the biggest bang for your buck in reducing the heating effect. If you could reduce methane emissions dramatically and fast, that's good. And tell us about what that means for New Zealand.
Yeah, so this is where it starts to cross over a little bit into what's happening in New Zealand because so there was a new climate metric that came out a few years ago, around 2018, called GWP STAR, Global Warming Potential STAR. And that was a way of looking at short-term and long-term gases more accurately, because the way we used treated them the same, but in fact, short-term gases behave very differently in the atmosphere to the way that carbon dioxide and those sort of long-term gases behave. So GWP star is a new way of looking at it that is much more accurate and is therefore useful for target setting and for understanding what's happening. But alongside of that research came some narratives that are not, that are a little bit more value-based and a little bit more political. And one of those narratives is this no additional heating that we've heard a lot from farmers in New Zealand. And in this report, and some of the people that wrote this new article, they were involved in the original introduction of GWP star. And they are basically saying that the science on GWP star has been misused to support inequitable claims that current levels of methane emissions cause no additional warming. They're saying that you can't apply that sort of thing at a country level, which is exactly what's going on in New Zealand at the moment. So the newly formed panel that the coalition government has set up, in the terms of reference, embedded in the terms of reference for that panel, is this principle of no additional warming. So they've tasked that panel with reviewing the country's methane targets based on the principle of no additional warming. And this new piece of research is basically saying that that's an abuse of the research, that's a misuse of GWP star. What's also interesting about that is two of the members of that panel were co-authors of the original research on GWP star. So these people all kind of know each other, and there's a bit of a stoush going on between how the information should be interpreted and what's fair to say and what's not what's not reasonable to claim. So it's interesting in that sense.
What struck me about this paper and the timing of it is that essentially it's saying the planet doesn't care about your manifesto. It doesn't care about your attempts to find the scientists that believe your particular politics. It's just going ahead and heating the planet and causing climate change, and we need to actually address that. We need to address the science and what's actually happening in the planet, rather than trying to find another goalpost or do what John Key said to Stephen Sacker in 2011 when he said, in response to criticism from Mike Joy, that, quote, he's one academic, and like lawyers, I could provide you others, which would give you a counter view. Well, no.
Alternative facts.
I mean, really. So this is...
May I ask, Bernard, and Catherine with this, there was I don't think it was, this issue of, there was criticism in that report that, in fact, some of the methane reduction possibilities for agriculture are already available, and New Zealand is choosing not to embrace them. Is that right?
I'm not. And what report was that? Sorry.
In this report this week about the government's assessment of how it's doing on climate change. When farming is of course the big problem. Is it that we're waiting for some new magical technology, or are we just not adapting to what's out there?
I mean, there's definitely ways that you can, and usually these are more efficient ways of farming that actually make you more profitable as well. So a lot of the more forward-thinking farmers already kind of adopt those approaches, but you get this long tail who just kind of are used to doing things their own way and don't, so part of it might be education, part of it might be just, this is how I do things and I don't want to change.
Essentially, this is an example where you need regulation to come in and say, reduce your emissions per kilogram of output by X so that we reduce our emissions by Y, and do it now. And let's not muck around here, because you're right. There are things that could be done. We could have less cows, and we could produce
fewer cows. I think. Thank you.
And that's we can muck around.
We've got many. Sorry, excuse me. We've got many fewer sheep.
Yeah.
Maybe we have fewer cows.
Yeah. Well,
maybe we should have more sheep and less cows.
Yeah.
But there
fewer cows.
Actually,
Jesus Christ.
Fewer cows.
Just leave the creator out of it.
There is a bit of that happening anyway because of the forestry.
Yes.
So the more
trees,
because
fewer
some
cows.
farms have been converted. Yeah. So there's a big question here around what our land use strategy ought to be in New Zealand, and that's something that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Simon Upton, has been doing a lot of work on, and that's another really good way to look at the whole thing. And I think in terms of dairy farming, there's so many other measures that we are also needing to manage, whether it's about water quality and things like that, that can also put sort of downward pressure on to increase or improve efficiency, but also reduce the number of...
Well, Catherine, I had my brother, who many people who've been early followers of the Hoon, who I haven't mentioned lately, over the other day, and he said, I'm bloody sick and tired of the farmers being blamed for the bad water. And then, of course, I think the same day I saw somebody sent me a picture of winter grazing in the South Island, and it didn't look good. Catherine, there isn't we talked maybe about this before, but there isn't a whole of government approach anymore here, is there?
Well, no. I mean, I think when you look at climate change overall, you've got different departments that are just acting in opposition to each other. So we've got that whole problem of the regulations and the rules and the actions working against each other. It's kind of paradoxical now.
Just finally, Catherine, I'm keen to ask about Air New Zealand this week, which set a precedent, becoming the first global airline to do something about the climate, but not in a good way. Could you talk about this?
Yeah, so, probably a lot of people have seen the announcement that Air New Zealand have announced that they're abandoning their 2030 targets and withdrawing from the Science Based Targets initiative. Now, they're claiming that they're still going to achieve their 2050 targets, but, part of achieving your 2050 targets is getting partway there with your 2030 ones. 2050 is just a lot further away, and you can kind of afford to say, we're hoping some new technologies come along. So I'm not sure that that's particularly useful, but it's interesting in the fact that they're the first global airline to drop out of the science-based targets, but they are certainly not the first company or global organisation to drop out. And in fact, the SBTI is having its own moment at the moment, and that has broader implications, which is quite interesting. So right back in, I think, March, the Science-Based Targets Initiative dropped something like 239 odd companies from their dashboard because they had failed to validate their commitments for 2030. And those companies include companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Unilever.
Everybody building the cloud and everybody building AI, for example.
Yeah, but even Unilever and Walmart and food and beverage organisations, and so a really wide range of big global companies all got tossed out because they weren't meeting their targets. And where most of them were really having trouble was with their Scope 3 emissions, which is in their supply chain that they don't directly control. And what they would like to do is to be able to offset them with carbon offsets. Yeah. And so right after that happened, the SBTI board came out saying, we're thinking about changing the rules to allow that. But that was news to most of their own staff who kind of, had a big...
Catherine, let me just intercede here slightly, because I'm seeing our YouTube traffic with people shitting on, being critical of Air New Zealand, which is understandable.
Yeah.
IATA says that the global airline industry will still meet its 2050 target. Let's also remember, just while we're being not nice to New Zealand, but they have a really serious problem at the moment with Pratt & Whitney and Rolls-Royce super energy efficient engines, and they also have jet engines rather, and they also have a serious problem with, as global airlines do, with the backup and supply of much more fuel efficient aircraft from both Boeing and Airbus. So, I think, and also they can't get, Air New Zealand in particular finds it very difficult to get, I've forgotten the acronym for it, the environmentally friendly SAFs. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a really strong argument here that their targets were never achievable in the first place, and a lot of achieving them was based on hoping for,
Did our current Prime Minister set those targets, or did Greg Foran set those targets?
Well, actually, it's worth having a look at some of the comments from Christopher Luxon in 2015 as the CEO.
I was thinking this, Bernard. Thank you.
Yes, so in 2015, he was celebrating in New Zealand winning the World Transport Association Sustainable Business Award. He was asked, how did it feel to achieve such an important international recognition? He said, quote, "It's always nice to be acknowledged with awards, especially in that case as it was in comparison with other tourism organisations, not just airlines. These are some fantastic community and environmental initiatives within the global tourism industry." Quote, "But the thing with sustainability," said Christopher Luxon in 2015, "is you're never the finished article. In fact, we're not even close. There's always more to do to improve." So we're focused on that.
Whoop-de-doo.
We're focused on that rather than reflecting too much on what has been achieved to date. We're focused on the future, not on what we've actually achieved.
We're focused on outcomes. I mean, really, Bernard. The question is, Kiwis want outcomes. We're focused on outcomes.
Yes, I will include
So
a link to that interview. Yep.
Greg Foran can blame the last governance
Yes,
of Air New
yes.
Zealand for where they're failing at the moment.
Oh, let's hope he does. If he's got any testicles, he might.
That's right. And interestingly, that the Te Whatu Ora board members are critical of Christopher Luxon as well, including one who worked with them as a fellow executive in 2012 at Air New Zealand. Okay, so
Catherine, thank you so much,
Catherine,
as always.
so much.
You're so authoritative. Somebody was just saying on the thing that this is the place you come for intelligence in New Zealand. Speaking of which, here's Vic.
Hey,
Now, Bernard, we're going to Vic because I agreed with our lovely producer Simon that we would skip and come back to the other thing that we sometimes
you.
talk about.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. Lovely to see you, Vic. It's wonderful to have you on the show as a long-time fan, first-time listener. To have you on the Hoon is fantastic. Vic Crockford is the CEO of Community Housing Aotearoa, who...
Bernard, I'm going to stop you there because I am no longer the CEO at Community Housing Aotearoa. That is the amazing Paul Gilbert.
Sorry.
I've moved down south, but do you know what? I am the convener of the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness and the
that's
biggest
good.
cheerleader for
When are you
Community
being
Housing
when you
Aotearoa
become
that there is.
when are you becoming the new chief executive of Kaingaora?
Yes, well, I must admit that we're all watching very avidly about what happens next for Kaingaora, but you can ask me anything you like about housing, but I certainly, I'm very
you so
pleased
much.
to see Paul in that amazing role now.
My apologies, Vic.
No
Lovely
problem,
to hear that news. Now, homelessness is an enormous issue. Community housing providers and Kaingaroa and many are doing amazing work. Could you tell us in particular about the issue with women's homelessness and why we talk about the missing middle in housing supply, but in homelessness, what's the story with women's homelessness that perhaps not everyone knows?
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. I think instinctively for a very long time, I've always known that the conditions that hold women in homelessness and in housing poverty are quite different from the conditions that hold men in homelessness. And I've known that because very early on, when I was 19, 20, I started volunteering with Wellington Women's Refuge. And so even back then, I'm 37 now, so 17 years ago, there were significant issues when women had come to us for support, been in a safe house for some time, to find them a home afterwards to go to. And what has happened since that time is obviously spending the time at Community Housing Aotearoa and getting to know lots of the housing providers around the country. One of the things that we were seeing increasingly was a really, really big rise in older women seeking housing support, but also a lot of invisibility of women who were experiencing chronic homelessness. So that's for two reasons. And I think if we think about the woman experiencing chronic homelessness first, for those women, a lot of the trauma that has created the pathway into homelessness often has to do with men. It will be family violence, potentially sexual violence. And so it's really unsafe for them to be in spaces that have men in them. And so there's not a lot of women's only emergency response or transitional housing. So a lot of them are couch surfing. And are a lot, sleeping in people's garages or just in places that housing providers were struggling to find them. And that's been a huge issue that Auckland City Mission in particular has sought to rectify with the opening of Te Wharehi Ngā Tore alongside Home Ground in Auckland.
I actually went to Home Ground this week. It was incredibly impressive and sobering, and really opened my eyes to some of these issues. In particular, the assumption is that most homeless people are old drunk men.
Yes,
And
correct.
but that's not the case, and many will need 1, 2, 3 bedroomed homes, not just a single studio apartment.
That's right. So a lot of women who are in the younger age bracket, we're talking anywhere from 16 to 25. We've heard a lot from kaimahi, from frontline workers, that we need to be really aware that women who have children at 16 are women, not rangatahi, because they have the needs of their children to think about when we're thinking about designing services. So lots of women will have caregiving responsibilities, including with kids. Research by He Kainga Oranga in Hamilton found that a lot of the women have 3 or more children. Some will have them with them and some will want them back. So that's a big issue, is the type of housing. And then I think for our older women, I think I bang on about this to you, and I have before, Bernard, but we have a real dearth of accessible housing and a real dearth of housing that is really safe and secure for older people to live. And there's a fantastic article in The Listener this week that I encourage everyone to read, where Jane Wrightson, the Retirement Commissioner, talks about the fact that the gender pay gap turns into the gender retirement gap, which turns into older women being one arm.
Yeah, this is. I was thinking about this as a contributing factor, because you're right about, obviously you're right about women in difficult situations and women staying with their kids. And I was struck. I hadn't really thought about this until I heard you speak just now. But I heard today a very good piece on the BBC about
he's heard a good piece on the BBC.
a woman living in her car. Yeah, but it was it was a 72-year-old woman living in her car in Australia. I didn't know Australia. Western Australia is the most prosperous areas of Australia. 20% increase in housing costs over the last year or so. I mean, Bernard is the world's expert on, or the New Zealand expert on, housing. This is just it's a kind of tragedy that's sitting right in front of us, because you do see, of course, people of women, particularly, as you say, older women who have missed out on various, pension entitlements and so on.
Opportunities.
It's a very difficult
That's right.
climate.
And I think I just want to come back to your point there, Peter, about it sitting right in front of us. So the MSD Housing Register, which is a very poor proxy for the real level of housing insecurity in this country, but nonetheless a proxy that we have, that doubled. Younger age groups have doubled in the last 5 years. People over 65 have tripled on the MSD housing register from that point in time 5 years ago. And if I think about the Christchurch Methodist Mission, who supports our work with the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness, they now have 2/3 of their waiting list for Wesley Care, their older person's village, which is subsidised social housing for older people, are women now. So that's flipped from 5 years ago. So their waiting list, the gender has flipped in terms of numbers. So we've really got a really entrenching crisis and a significant policy and funding gap to address any of that.
So, Vic, not to politicise this too much, but I'm thinking about the pressure that's on Kaingora, and thinking in a very specific example about the new development at Kaingora in Point Chev, which is a sort of modular set of building, quite an amazing and now very, not unattractive building, designed for people, I think, over 50 or over 55, mostly single people, presumably, now that we understand this as you've described it so well, women. I mean, what is your reaction to the shift in government approach to Kaingora?
I have two main reactions. The first is that I believe, as someone who's come to have a very deep intellectual investment in housing, that a strong kāinga order is really important in our system, in our housing system. As part of, it's a really critical piece of the puzzle, if you like. And a strong kāinga order looks not just at like a kāinga order with a particular type of balance sheet or a particular number of homes, but a kāinga order that actually can serve the communities that it's in a way that's really great for those individual communities. My second reaction is that I do think that, and again, I think I said this the first time I ever spoke to Bernard, we do far too much pendulum swinging in this country when it comes to housing policy. And I do think that the previous government, as significant as their efforts were, swung too far towards centralisation and away from the opportunities that existed in the community and in iwi and Māori housing as well. I think that was starting to change near the end of their last term with the introduction of various funds, but also the introduction of the place-based approach, which I do think has real integrity. But I certainly think at a meta level, if you like, that the growth of kāinga order sometimes did come at a cost to some of the community housing and iwi and Māori housing opportunities that there are.
Thank you. Bernard, you still got your mic off.
But it looks like you're saying something very intelligent.
He is. He was.
And it will go in the edit. Thanks, Simon. Just thinking, Vic, about all of those discussions we've had over the many, many years. I've been talking about this since 2008-9, saying housing is unaffordable. It's the main thing. We have a housing market that is the economy now. And we need so many more houses, healthy houses, dense houses, just so many houses. What do you think? You're in there day in, day out. What do you think about how we can solve this? If we, took an actual, emergency response, if we thought it was like the beginning of World War II, what would we do?
If we thought it was the beginning of World War II, there would be three key things that we would do. And one of those things, and I'm going to say it and everyone's going to throw their hands in the air because it's impossible right now because recession, economy, we just need a ton of money in the system. This stuff costs money. As housing is our most important social infrastructure, and infrastructure requires investment. It also requires maintenance. So I would just say we just need to get serious about the type of money that's required to address this problem. In the trillions, it's absolutely our most critical investment we can make. It's the foundation of everybody's lives. So that's up there. I'm not immune to the knowledge of the economic situation we're in. So I say that with aspiration, but I do think we need to be serious about quantifying it and making a commitment. The second thing we need is a bipartisan national housing strategy that we commit to over the long term. And that goes to that point about pendulum swinging. We just simply can't keep going from market to state without any long-term certainty for all of the people working on the pipes, the roads, the houses, but also all those wraparound services. I mean, I know you covered the food insecurity issue that's happening. All of that is part of this same conversation. The third thing is we absolutely need to take, for those academics out there, you'll love this, an intersectional approach where we're actually thinking about who we're designing for. We're thinking about women, we're thinking about culture, we're thinking about Māori, we're thinking about Pacifica, we're thinking about people who have intergenerational family cultures, and we're not doing a one-size-fits-all approach, or indeed an approach that is designed around what we think the norm of homelessness might be.
Vic, inevitably, somebody in our YouTube space is now asking when you're running for Prime Minister, please.
Oh,
You're not the first. You're not the first amazing person that we've had on who people have said, Jesus Christ, she'd be good. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it'd be great until I had to find the $3 trillion, Peter. So I'm pretty aware of those trade-offs.
And speaking of swinging pendulums,
Yes.
the health budget.
Yes, no. Vic, you mentioned you were in the third thing, and I was curious. Did we?
So my final thing is actually, I just think right now we're in a place of poverty of spirit. This funding scarcity has caused a scarcity mindset, and I'm someone that reflects as much on the way people think as what people do. And I'd love us to get back to a place where we're thinking about the possibilities. And I know there's a lot of, stubborn optimism, I guess, is the language of it, but also realizing that housing is our biggest community wealth asset, and it's intergenerational and it's critical, and we should be aspirational about how we want people to live. So I just think for me, it's how we get ourselves out of the poverty mindset and get real about addressing the issues.
Vic, thank you so much for
Thank you
coming
very
on to the
much,
show.
Vic. That was absolutely brilliant, especially, and I hope I didn't interrupt you to get the third point up, but that is such a good thought about not being in this dark climate, and we're going to explore this a little bit further with the doctor on your right hand side in a moment.
Oh,
Yes.
fantastic.
Yes, we're going to have Gary Panda on, who's an accident emergency doctor at Whangarei Hospital, and he'll be back on to talk to us. Vic Crotford, the chair of the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness.
Indeed. Thanks,
Fantastic.
Bernard.
I really appreciate your time. Lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you too, Bernard. Nice to see you, Peter.
Thank you, Vic.
Okay.
And I think
Rakete.
Ka kite ana.
that's great to have you on. We're just having a few tech issues with Gary.
He seems like an extraordinarily clever chap, Bernard. I mean, we'll have to say that when he comes on. But Vic, really, I mean, as usual, Bernard, you've turned this entire thing into housing today.
Well, housing is everything. It's the only thing that ever matters. It's the reason we're in such grief and strife.
Yeah.
If only we had affordable housing, everything else would be so much easier to deal with. The expensive food, the expensive electricity, the
But
poverty.
Bernard, I afforded my house. I worked hard for my house. I can have my house and, a batch and probably 2 or 3 other houses. I can have a housing empire, as someone described Christopher Luxon rather stupidly in I think it was in the Post, and one described him as having a housing empire, which was ridiculous.
Well,
He does have a housing empire, but it's called Kaingora.
Well, yeah, actually, but he's the MP with the most number of houses.
Is he?
With the biggest value of those houses,
Mm-hmm.
who has made more money from his housing investments than he ever made as the CEO of
that's a very
major
good story,
organisation
Bernard.
in Unilever or Air New Zealand. And he's not the first Air New Zealand CEO to have done that. The previous CEO of Air New Zealand has said that he made more money from his property investments than as a business leader of New Zealand's most successful international company. That's where we are in New Zealand. It's awful. And we heard this morning that the Prime Minister is looking to sell some of his rental properties.
Yeah.
Gary,
Gary.
It's lovely to have you on. Can you hear us there?
I can hear you. Earbud's
wonderful.
not working, but as long as you can hear my audio well, I'm happy.
We can. Thank you very much, Gary. It's really good to see you.
Wonderful. We really appreciate you coming on and talking about these issues. This week, the health crisis, I think, became something that suddenly everyone was talking about, everyone could see in their faces. Suddenly this huge wave of news about, the hospitals without doctors at night, waiting lists extending, people discovering late they had cancer. Everything came together this week, partly because, obviously we had the government announce at the last week they were replacing the Te Whatu Ora Board with a commissioner. And suddenly, everyone started to say, hang on a minute, is that right? So I wondered, for you, as someone who's, in the trenches, so to speak, really close to what's going on at in A&Es, as a doctor in Whangarei's A&E, as I understand it, could you tell us whether this is just a financial incompetence issue and something can be dealt with by a new manager and a new set of directions from the government, or something much more substantial?
So that's a lot. There's a lot wrapped up in there, but in essence, the chickens are coming home to roost. I've been working in Whangarei for 17 years as a doctor in the emergency department, and during that time, I've seen multiple governments underinvest, both in staff and in infrastructure. We've kept kicking the can down the road for decades now, and it's finally catching up with us. So just today, I learned that there was a time in New Zealand's glorious history in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where we had 5 to 6 times as many hospital beds per capita as we have now. Like that's that's incredible. And it brings me back to my town here, my area. Whangarei Hospital is about 60 years old. And when it was built, it was adequate for the community. It was right sized. It was doing its job. I'm still in that decrepit hospital now. And every year for the past 17 years, they've kept telling us that a new build is 5 to 7 years away. And I'll ask you now, how long do you think they're saying that the new build is? 7 years away. That's when they're going to get the new hospital fully going, supposedly. What's different, I think, in the past is that, well, we had, let's say, 5 times as many hospital beds as we do now. But how much has Northland grown in those years, since the 60s to the 80s to now? It's tripled in population. And the population's got older and sicker and needing more hip replacements, heart attacks, all of that stuff. And so you say, if we've shrunken the infrastructure, and we're talking about rebuilding one hospital always 7 years away, that will be smaller than what we need on the very day it opens, will be grossly inadequate for our needs. So now you multiply that around the country, because I don't want to give the impression that this is a Dargaville or a Northland problem. This is in a lot of places. And you understand the kind of problem that we're facing now. The thing that makes it a little bit different this time around, however, is that the level of sort of denial and misinformation and scapegoating and gaslighting. It's really incredible. Like, literally, I write these things down on a sheet of paper because they seem so exceptional to me, and I don't want to forget them. We have Shane Reti, the health minister, saying there will be no cuts to the front line. What is this conversation we're having now? It's about doctorless hospitals, right? It's insane to say that there are not cuts to the front line. Lester Levy, quote, no cuts to clinical staff and no need for more money, and that he will cut Health New Zealand by 1.4 billion. Margie Appa, the CEO of Health New Zealand, literally quoted as saying, we have overcorrected the healthcare worker shortage. And she said, if we go back a few years, we were facing a workforce shortage, but we've overcorrected it now. Shane Reti doubling down on this obvious untruth and saying, yeah, we're oversubscribed, we've overhired. One only has to look at reality to understand the situation we're in. Well, go ahead, ask your question. I can keep going forever because this is very, very personal. This isn't like a hobby for me. This is serious.
No. Bernard, you're on mute, you bloody idiot.
So, Gary, you're talking about what's happening on the ground and that it's personal because that's the thing you do every day. What are you actually seeing as people come in the door, the long-term effects of the underfunding, but also the A&E is the sort of pressure point in the pipeline where if it failed up there, it's going to hit down here.
So, and that's why emergency doctors, part of it, the reason why we go into it, because they're these are the places where the poor can come, where anyone can come in their moment of need, middle of the night, we'll take care of them, no questions asked. That's what we do. But like, I had a colleague take a picture of the board 3 or 4 days ago, and for the first time ever, we hit 200% occupancy. Now, that may mean nothing for the average listener out there, but I can tell you an ED should never even be at 100% because it has to have a little bit of leeway for an emergency, for someone that has a cardiac arrest down in the waiting room, for a new ambulance that comes in. When you're at 100%, you're not providing great care. So I can leave it up to your imagination. When you're at 200%, how do you think that's working out for patients or doctors? It means that your entire ED is filled. Every bed space, every chair, you've got trolley beds, gurneys down the hallway and the back corridor, and you're packed, and you've got an equal number of patients in the waiting room that you're trying to see. And it's not good medicine. It's not what we want. I can almost guarantee you that Christopher Luxon, Shane Reti, Lester Levy will never have to wait 7 hours to be seen by a doctor in a waiting room. Because of their privilege, their wealth, their fame, probably their private health insurance, they are insulated from the real world effects of all of this. But our patients here see it. And Northland is sort of the canary in the coal mine. So we had Rawene Hospital lose its ability to staff its hospital about a year ago. It had to give up having a proper little medical ward. And so now its patients come to Whangarei. Dargaville is the next domino to fall. And now we're hearing that it can't cover nights and weekends, that it's a doctorless hospital during those times, with essentially a nurse and a smartphone with a telehealth link. Kaitaia has had to go to life-preserving services only because it just didn't have the doctor resource to take care of patients. And Bay of Islands is saying that it's under unbelievable distress because in the midpoint of next month, doctor staffing is not there. And it's coming soon to an ED near you. Maybe you live in a more affluent neighborhood, I don't know, but eventually it shall reach you and impact you.
Well, Gary, may I ask? It's Peter here. It's been very interesting. We have people on YouTube, on our YouTube feed now, saying how brilliant you've been on RNZ. I've been following you for a couple of years, I think, on YouTube, on Twitter, where I think you're very cogent and thoughtful on all of this. I was in an ED in the Auckland hospital ED a couple of weeks ago at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, which is possibly the worst time you could imagine going there. I imagine it's even worse at midnight. And apart from pissed people coming in, there were huge numbers of people who you might have imagined would have gone otherwise to their GP, but didn't face the fee for going to the GP. Just, you seem to be a kind of a spokesman at the moment in a way that is quite difficult. I mean, this is more of a personal question, really. You are being the spokesman for a generation in a sense and exposing yourself. What's that about, and why? I mean, good on you, but tell us a little bit about that risk that you're taking.
I don't think you can work in the emergency department. Again, we're dedicated to taking care of everyone, regardless of need, or regardless of anything. We'll take care of you. And this is an extension of that. Like, I went into this, I've been working 17 years in an underserved area. There's a reason for that, right? If I wanted to work in a very easy job with, high remuneration and, patients who are very lucky in life, I would have done that. But I choose to be here because, and for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which, the patients are wonderful. They don't complain. And that's part of the problem here. I'm speaking in part for them. Northlanders are stoic. They're long suffering. They've been dealing with poverty and lack of access for an awfully long time. And they're not going to be the ones that write a letter to the editor the day after it happens. And so I want to speak for them. I think it's important, and the feedback I get from nurses and healthcare assistants and PAs and secretaries and patients is well worth it. And if there are repercussions from that, then I have to be prepared to deal with them. But I think I'm trying to do the right thing here and make sure patients get good care and not worse care.
Gary, it's really quite something to hear from the front lines, what's going on, and in such a refreshing and clear way. Just finally, let's say Shane Reti, who I'm guessing I mean, he is a doctor from Northland, but also let's say Shane Reti and Christopher Luxon are in Whangarei in that hospital, and you happened to be in a lift with them at the same time. What's your elevator pitch to them? What do you say to those guys in the 30 seconds you've got to say, here's what's happening, here's what you should do?
I would say this. I understand that there's problems that go back decades, right? Through labor and then national before that. But the thing that is different this time is that all of the resilience has been eaten up out of the system. There's not primary care to fall back on. They're in absolute crisis. There's not an ambulance service that easily has plenty of staff to go around. We are tired, and the patients are suffering. And the worst thing about it all is not that there are shortages. We can deal with problems, but that there is a denial, a refusal to tell the truth about what's going on. The thing that a hardworking ED nurse finds irksome is that they're being told that nursing is overstaffed. That's the bit that can't stand. This rhetoric and this misinformation, these lies, these slight mistruths, however you want to call it, saying that there's no effect on clinical services and there's no harm to frontline staff. There'll be no harm to patients. Come on, like, it's obvious that this is hurting people. We have doctorless hospitals. We have 200% capacities in EDs for the first time that any of us can remember. I've been doing it 17 years and I don't remember that happening. And it's happening widespread now. Again, not just North. And so, yeah, but you said 30 seconds. They would have stopped listening to me long ago. They would have gotten off that elevator because...
Well, the elevator's quite short. In the new hospital, it's going to be 11 stories, so the elevator will be a bit longer.
In 7 years.
I'm looking forward to it.
That's
and
right.
If it happens before I retire or die, I will be surprised, Peter.
And push the button that stops it halfway between the
Yeah,
floors.
and Gary, I was going to say to people who are listening, because you're getting tremendous feedback from our audience, and I know you will when Bernard releases this tomorrow, that they see this as very important. You probably know Dave Galler, the former head of emergency medicine at Middlemore. I mean, his book and his play.
I see you, if I'm not mistaken. But,
yeah, I see. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
yes.
Go ahead.
Things that matter is really important on this area. And I couldn't recommend it more to people who are watching. But this is not a fresh problem, but it is, as you say, it's very shocking to hear, as you say, how critical it is because there's no backup.
Yeah, and again, the rhetoric around this, saying that, there's really no impact on the front lines. My gosh, you are seeing doctors and nurses come out of the woodwork on this one because we know it's impacting the front line.
Okay, Gary, let me ask you one question on this as well, because you've had very good access to the media. You're brilliant on Twitter and explaining this. I think you take great risks. What does the New Zealand media need to do to explain this better? Or is it explaining it well? I don't know. What do you think? What's the media's role in this?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are some... Yeah, that's a tough one, and I have to be cautious in how I answer it, to be honest.
How about
the media's? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Bernard's in it.
I think this is a great topic for thinking about and then talking about, and I would love to have you on again, Gary, in a few weeks' time to talk about this, because I think about this a lot.
Yeah, me too.
In the last week, I have spent an awful lot of time listening to the Prime Minister, going through reports, trying to understand what's actually happening, and essentially calling bullshit. In my view, my role in the media and the role of media is to compare what is actually happening with what the politicians say they're doing and what the politicians say they want to do and what they think is happening, and to marry the two. And when it doesn't, we call bullshit. And I...
All right. Bernard, do I have 1 minute to ask those questions?
Sure.
I've got 3 for you.
Yeah,
and this will give you something to work on between now and the next time I talk to you. Ready?
Good.
Go for it, Dr. Reid.
The first one is, and this is specifically for Shane Reti and
Dr.
Lester
Ross,
Lee.
rather.
Yep.
Yeah. I would like to know if they have an overt plan to push healthcare privatization in New Zealand. Is that part of the architecture of this? Do they want to divert public taxpayer money away from the public healthcare system, hospitals and whatever, GPs and whatnot, and into private imaging, private radiology, private CTs, private surgeries, private hospitals. The corollary to that then would be Lester Levy is well known for either owning, running, or founding a host of private medical enterprises. If there's a private dollar to be made in medicine in New Zealand, he has led it, worked with it, advised it, or owned it. And I would like to know also with Shane, if the fact that they had or perhaps have, maybe currently have, I don't know, these private healthcare ownership, does it impact the kind of direction they see things going in the future in New Zealand? Because I think a lot of us see it heading in that direction, but I just want some journalists to actually have the guts to ask those questions. And then the final one is, this is a pretty honest and fair one, I think. How many of the MPs have private health insurance? Because I feel like if you have wealth and you have private health insurance and you have a little bit of fame, you're an important person, you are so insulated from everything bad that happens in this country that you're almost on a different planet. And I would love to see some sort of list of who's got private health insurance and who doesn't. I think that's very meaningful.
That's such a good reference, Gary.
I'm not blaming them for having private health insurance. Fine, but I would like to know who I'm dealing with.
Yes, I think, Gary, that's having lived in the UK for most of the last 30 years, the creation of a crisis in the health service is an excellent stepping off point for additional privatization. Whether it's overt or absolutely brilliant for both the private health industry, for those who can get it, and for the political will to push people over that edge, as opposed to what we know, even in the UK, for example, where a smaller percentage of GDP in the UK is spent on health, as opposed to the US with a fully privatized service, which takes, I forget the percentage of GDP in the US, and the outcomes are worse.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Oh, is that my soliloquy, Bernard?
Yes,
sorry,
indeed. It was great. Dr. Gary Panda, an A&E doctor at Whangarei Base Hospital. Gary, it's been fantastic to have you on. We really
Thank you
appreciate
so much, Gary. I'm so glad Bernard found you.
My pleasure. Thank you for doing this. I think it's important that people talk about this and get it out there.
And we're really glad we were able to go on a little bit longer than we normally would, just because it was so compelling. Thank you very much, Gary. Finally, I'm going to let you leave, and then Peter, finally, a skateboarding dog.
Well, we didn't do international work, so
no,
let me just think about the assassination of the second leader, of the political leader of Hamas overnight. I mean, in a way, that is the classic Israeli tactic, which is unbelievably strategic, unbelievably clever, probably with a drone perhaps. It's still unclear exactly how they did it, but they've put Iran on notice that they can get anywhere at any time in any place. And of course, they've done the same to Hamas. And they did something very similar, although a little bit messier, with Hezbollah 2 days ago. I think we can expect something comparable to the drone and missile strikes that Iran launched against Israel in April. And we will see almost exactly, I would imagine, the same response from the international community, which is to deflect it and fix it up. It's a really interesting story, and of course we need to stay on top of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of civilization as we know it. So the skateboarding dog story that we were going to do...
Sorry.
No, that's no worries. Is because I think that guy Gary Panda, I really have admired him on and I think he's taking a little bit of a risk actually, stepping out the way he is. And I think his comment about privatization, I fear, is potentially true. So it's hard to redo the Trump thing today about questioning Kamala Harris's origins, but he did it at the National Association of Black Journalists meeting. It was quite spectacular. One of the great things about Trump, which I actually weirdly sort of admire, is that he always says the quiet bit out loud. But I think what we can also see is that this is not just an accident by him. It's going to be a part of the attack on Kamala Harris by the entire Republican engine over the next few months. But we talk a little bit sometimes about how this is relevant to New Zealand. And we've seen some really awkward things recently from ACT around Maoridom and removing various processes, whether that's in Farmac or the decision this week about Maori wards. And then you've also got Te Pāti Māori talking about who is and who isn't properly Maori. And this kind of stuff is coming across from the US. And let's remember that under the when the founding fathers were setting up the Constitution, slaves were regarded as 3/5 of a person. And you went down into this issue of quadroons, people who were a quarter black, and octoroons who were an eighth. This is a very dark passage. So Trump said today she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn and became a black person. She was only promoting her Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black. Now she wants to be known as black. She had to turn black. This is dark stuff, and we should be very careful about it. Sorry, I didn't mean to do an actual soliloquy on it. It's lovely to see you, Bernard.
Yeah.
And thank you, everybody,
Thank you for staying on a little bit longer. We just thought it was so interesting this week. I've worked a little bit hard this week to try to cover the health sector.
Good.
And the last 4 dawn choruses have focused on it a lot. And I think that the comments from Gary Payenda about how doctors and nurses are looking at each other with like open mouths and wide eyes and going, did he say that? Did he really think that's what's actually going on? There's this moment, I think, and it's rare in New Zealand because most politicians and ministers are quite close to the ground. We know them. We know where they live. We've got their phone number probably. New Zealand's a small place. And for people to come out like that and to, gaslight's a very modern phrase, but to actually say black is white when it's not is quite a thing. And I'm glad to see some of the body politic, the people who run the joint, the directors and the doctors, and are actually standing up in an unusual way and saying, no, bullshit, that's not true. I know because I'm there, and you can't say that. And so this is an interesting moment, I think, this week.
It is. I'm slightly worried that the media is so weakened that it's not in a position to really tackle this. So you and I are going to have to do it alone, Bernard.
Well, no, there's
us against the world.
Yes.
And our audience.
I've seen some people say that actually this week, that the reason the health crisis has not become an electrifying, massive issue is that we don't have current affairs television anymore. 10 years ago, with Holmes, Campbell, there would have been uproar, outrage, coverage, wall to wall. There is nothing. There is just 7 Sharp. And
we'll be doing a story on a privatized hospital soon, no doubt. Given their linkages to advertorial, undeclared advertorial.
Yes.
That was mean of me, but thank you, Bernard. That was brilliant. And everybody is saying, I think the Kaka is going to go bonkers tomorrow with new subscriptions. Everybody's here saying how fabulous you are.
Thank you very much. And we've given an enormously difficult job to Simon, our editor, to cut it down.
Poor old Simon.
No, we thank you very much, everyone. Ka kite, anō. See you next week.
Thanks so much, Bernard. Bye.